I will walk away from this book with the author's very graphic description of what Jesus endured. That's what I'm going to remember most about this book. So that's where I'm going to start. Jesus Christ's resurrection, his coming back to life, is considered the ultimate proof that he is God. But a cynical person might say, well, how do we know he actually died on the cross? Because if he didn't actually die, he couldn't have been resurrected. How certain was the slow and crude form of execution on a cross? And to answer that question, Lee Strobel looked into the actual process of a Roman crucifixion in his book, The Case for Christ. This is the student edition. And I'm going to read his exact words, and I have to warn you, it is disturbing, it is gruesome, but I think it's important to know because Jesus went to that cross willingly, and what he endured is a testament to how much he actually loves us. You know, he was willing to die a horrible death to pay for the sins of the world so that people could be made right with God. So let's find out exactly what Jesus went through. And I'm going to start with the flogging, also known as whipping. Flogging in the Roman Empire followed a predictable and consistent pattern. The soldier would use a whip of braided leather thongs with metal balls woven into them, and when the whip would strike the flesh, these balls would cause deep bruises which would break open with further blows. The back of the person being flogged would be so shredded that part of the spine was sometimes exposed by the deep cuts. The whip had pieces of sharp bone on it as well, and that is what cut into the flesh. The lash of the whip would go all the way from the shoulders down to the back, the buttocks, and the back of the legs. The whip would tear into underlying muscles to produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh and sometimes even expose internal organs. Usually flogging consisted of 39 lashes, although a soldier might inflict more depending on his mood. Many people died from flogging even before they could be crucified. Those who didn't die often went into shock. And by the time the soldiers were done flogging Jesus, he would have been in serious condition even before the first nail was driven in to hang him on the cross, when the executioner would have taken 2 sharp spikes, each 5 to 7 inches long, and nailed one through each wrist into the beam. Now, when you see pictures of Jesus or paintings, you usually see that nail driven through his hand. But the nail was actually driven through the wrists, between the bones in the wrists, because this would not support the weight of a body hanging on a cross. It would have ripped right through. So they put the nail in the wrist. As the nerves pierced the wrist, they would have crushed the large nerve that goes to the hand. If you've ever banged your funny bone, you've experienced what it is to jar a nerve. So imagine taking a pliers and squeezing the nerve in your funny bone, and you have some idea of the pain that the spikes in the wrist caused. Severed nerves and dislocated joints don't necessarily kill a person. Once a person is hanging in the vertical position, crucifixion is essentially an agonizingly slow death by asphyxiation. In order to exhale, the person being crucified must push up on his feet. When he did that, the nails would tear through the feet until they eventually locked up against the ankle bones. And after he managed to exhale, the person would then be able to relax down and take another breath in. Again, he'd have to push himself up to exhale, scraping his bloodied back against the rough wood of the cross, and this would go on and on until complete exhaustion would take over, and the person wouldn't be able to push up and breathe anymore. And as the person's breathing slowed down, the lack of oxygen would lead to an erratic heartbeat and eventually cardiac arrest. So he ends that chapter with, "My own conclusion after weighing the evidence was to rule out the theory that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. That suggestion no longer seemed plausible. But remember that the central claim of Christianity is not just Jesus' death, but his resurrection." So in chapter 8, Strobel examines the next question: did Jesus really come back to life after he died? And that chapter is titled, "What Happened to the Body?" The evidence of the Gospels and of the early church and of the Jewish leaders, they all point to an empty tomb. And by the end of chapter 8, Strobel points out the radical change in the disciples. At the time of Jesus' death, they were depressed. And a short time later, the disciples were out boldly proclaiming that Jesus is alive. So these once cowardly men were transformed into individuals so certain of what they saw, the resurrected Jesus, that they were willing to go to their death proclaiming that he is the Son of God who came back from the grave. So not only were they willing to go to their death, almost all of them, 10 out of the 11 remaining disciples, were put to death for their faith. Yet none of them gave up their testimony that the resurrection was real and that it authenticated Jesus' claim that he is God. So, after Jesus appeared alive to the 12 disciples, he appeared to more than 500 believers at the same time, and that is reported by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians. Reports of Jesus' resurrection became more numerous throughout the Gospels, especially in the book of John. So Strobel ruled out that these sightings of the resurrected Jesus were just legends or hallucinations or even wishful thinking. And then he poses this question: what difference does it really make whether Jesus showed up and proved he was alive to a bunch of people who are now dead themselves? Because if Jesus' resurrection doesn't have anything to do with life today, does it matter whether he rose from the dead or not? And the answer to that question is the ongoing encounter with the resurrected Christ that happens all over the world, in every culture, to people from all kinds of backgrounds and personalities. And they all will tell you that more than any single thing in their lives, Jesus Christ has changed them. Now, I can attest to this because I know someone who was radically changed by 2 encounters with Jesus. I'm not going to give a lot of detail. I'll just say that this was a very mean, hateful person who was radically changed by an encounter with Christ, and then a second encounter with him where this person actually saw Jesus. So you can't argue with a personal testimony. You just can't. And there's another example of a man whose life was changed by Christ, and that is Professor J.P. Moreland. That's included in the book, his interview with Professor Moreland. Moreland was a cynical chemistry major at the University of Missouri when he was confronted with the fact that if he examined the claims of Jesus Christ critically and with an open mind, there was more than enough evidence for him to believe it. Now, I'm going to voice my own opinion here. This is not in the book, but I think that anyone who rejects Christianity, anyone who rejects Jesus Christ, it is not the result of them actually looking into the evidence. Because if they did look into the proof of Jesus, they would also be converted. In other words, their rejection of Christ is due to their stubborn hearts and their wanting to remain in their sinful lifestyles, their desire to continue in the way they're living. That is why they reject Jesus. It's not because they've made any kind of informed decision. And if that hits home with you, feel free to be convicted. Back to J.P. Moreland, he decided to step into the direction that the evidence was pointing by receiving Jesus, and he began to relate to him in a real and an ongoing way. And he reported to Strobel during his interview, this is his quote, "In the 3 decades since then, I've had hundreds of specific answers to prayers. I've had things happen that simply cannot be explained by natural explanations, and I have experienced a changed life beyond anything I could have imagined." So the ultimate way to know if Jesus is alive is to accept him and start relating to him, because if you look into the evidence, but you don't take that final step, then you are completely missing where that evidence is leading. So the rest of what I'm going to share is the original opening for this video. I had a different opening until I felt convicted to start with Jesus Christ's crucifixion and his resurrection. This is just giving you some background on the book and the author and his journey from atheist to Christian. So, The Case for Christ, Student Edition, retraces the events that led to a nearly 2-year exploration of the evidence for and against believing in Christ. It was written by Lee Strobel, a legally trained investigative reporter who wrote for the Chicago Tribune for 14 years. In the original best-selling book, The Case for Christ, Strobel cross-examines more than a dozen experts, scholars in the fields of scripture and medicine and psychology, and specialists in the areas of old manuscripts and biblical studies. Strobel was actually an atheist when he began his investigation of the evidence of Jesus. So along with being an apologetics book about Jesus Christ, it is also a personal account of Strobel's journey from atheist to Christian. And that transformation happened because Strobel began to question his atheist beliefs as he learned the truth about the evidence of Jesus. After seeing the evidence, he could only conclude that the Bible is accurate and Jesus was who he said he was, the Son of God, and he did die on a cross and was resurrected. So what finally brought him to faith in God was discovering the truth. As a young man just out of college, Strobel basically believed that God was a fairy tale. But there were two things that led up to this investigation of Jesus. And the first thing, he began to notice a selfishness in himself, like a hardened heart. He started to question, why do I only care about myself? You know, he didn't have any compassion for people who were going through difficult times. You know, they gave an example of a story that he was chasing, and this person was pouring her heart out about all her difficulties, and really difficult. I mean, I'm talking about major life hardships, and he had absolutely no compassion for her. All he was caring about is how good his story was going to be. That's all he cared about. He cared about himself, and that was it. So that's what he meant by a hardened heart and selfishness. And he wondered, why doesn't all my success satisfy me? There was this longing in him, this never satisfied, always wanting more, always wanting, you know, the next thing that was going to bring him some happiness. He just never felt satisfied. But what really prompted him to look into the Case for Christ was when his wife, Leslie, announced that she had become a Christian. And I'm going to read to you his comment about that. The more Leslie changed in positive ways, the more obvious it became that my own life and relationships were messed up. It was as if Leslie were holding up a mirror and I was seeing myself as I really was, and I didn't like the picture. So, I'll give you a quick list of some of the things that Strobel investigated for 1 year and 9 months as he sorted through the evidence for and against Christ, and then I'll wrap this up. He looked into the accuracy of the Bible, mainly the reliability and the origins of the New Testament. He looked into historical evidence of Jesus, what was left behind. He looked into Jesus' claim to be the Son of God, and that was the crime for which he was put to death. He was accused of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God. So Strobel wanted to know, is there any credible evidence to back up who Jesus claimed to be? He also looked into the claim that Jesus is the only way to God. He looked into archaeological evidence. He even looked into the details of the events leading up to the crucifixion. And this is very interesting. He looked into, for example, in the book of Luke, it says, when Jesus was praying before he was arrested, his sweat was like drops of blood. And it turns out, after investigating this, Strobel discovered that doctors today recognize a rare medical condition called hematidrosis that looks like what Luke described, sweating drops of blood. And what happens is that high anxiety causes certain chemicals to release into the capillaries in the sweat glands. And then these chemicals break down the capillaries, these very tiny blood vessels, so that there is a small amount of bleeding right into the sweat glands. When the sweat comes out, it is tinged with blood. So I thought that was really interesting that he discovered that. I mean, this man knew how to investigate a case. He knew how to sift through evidence. He was a journalist with legal training from Yale Law School. He left no stone unturned. So he said, before he even started his investigation, he made a decision. And this was the decision he made. He said, if the evidence of history established convincingly that Jesus is who he claimed to be, the one and only Son of God, then I would have no choice but to follow him. My fruitless pursuit of happiness changed into a relentless pursuit of truth, and that is what fueled my investigation into the evidence about Christ. So how does the book end? Well, it ends with a prayer. It is the prayer that he prayed before he even started the investigation. That I guess I mentioned it took almost 2 years for him to finish just the investigation itself. That was before he even started writing the book. So it says, here's the prayer I prayed when I started my own investigation into the case for Christ. God, I don't even believe you're there, but if you are, I want to find you. I really do want to know the truth, so if you exist, please show yourself to me. He says you can use this prayer or one of your own, but brace yourself. You may get what you ask for. I did. And that closing thought is what inspired me to title this, Careful What You Ask For. Thanks for listening. I appreciate everyone who watches these videos. I appreciate my subscribers. I pray for you. I pray for your health. I pray for your healing and any financial issues you might be having. And I pray that the right topic will find you at the right time. And I hope you'll share these videos with others. You know, you also can be an evangelist by liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting. Doing all these things will push this video into the YouTube algorithms and let it be seen by more people. So you'll be doing your part. I appreciate that. I'll see you next week.